Even Susan Collins is having to admit defeat in the smear campaigns against Graham. That's what happens when you had the entire country waiting for some big scandal that never came. But this thing isn't over yet, and Platner still has his foot on the neck of the Collins campaign, because it turns out that there might have been a lot of issues that Susan was trying to hide with these New York Times distractions, especially since more and more scandalous information keeps coming out about the heights of Collins' corruption.
Platner then turned attention to Collins' financial disclosures and her growing wealth since entering the Senate. Platner listed his own net worth at $100,000, while listing Collins as up to $9.6 million. Collins' husband, Thomas DeFron, owns stock in several defense contracting companies, while Collins chairs the Senate Appropriations Committee, a nugget the Democrats have long targeted Collins on. Platner listed his oyster farm as his greatest asset, while pinning Collins' greatest asset as her stock portfolio.
It turns out that Susan Collins has one of the most successful and therefore corrupt stock portfolios in Congress. Corruption that the MAGA-Stapo are trying to turn around and put onto Platner now. Fox had some henchmen on to throw these wild accusations out about Graham.
With an individual like Platner, the first thing you have to understand is he's proven himself to be a pathological liar from the very beginning. The oyster business, totally fake. There's no oyster men in Maine. Everyone who hears that laughs. It's a joke. He's the first oyster man. He's the first person to ever call himself an oyster man or be described that way. There are oyster farms and oyster farmers, but there's no such thing as an oyster man. And if you look at the date that his website for his fake oyster business was created, it was created after Graham for Maine, his Senate website. The entire thing is a campaign prop.
Platner responded to these insane accusations because why would they tell such an obviously verifiable lie? Using some website to imply that the whole company is fake is hilarious, since the oyster farm didn't need a website until the campaign became a thing. It's almost like Trump's grocery thing, where the elitists assume that every blue-collar, small-town farm has a slick website. Graham says this is false and defamatory, and then asks, hasn't Fox News learned their lesson after paying Dominion nearly $800 million? Fox News is clearly just padding their runtime with lies because they know they can't talk about their own candidates' news. If they did, they'd be the only ones because literally none of the mainstream media are covering this, which is why you should subscribe to US Democratic Socialists. In the midst of all of the fake drama, Susan Collins has been nursing a scandal of her own. Susan Collins failed to report nearly $400,000 in stock trades. Despite promising to only run for 2 terms during the friggin' Ice Age, Collins has instead spent her 29 years in office lining her own pockets. Her net worth has shot up from around $100K to somewhere like $7 million, and that's thanks to her investments in a myriad of evil companies. But the most egregious explains why she's falling over herself to protect the oil and gas companies, especially her precious ConocoPhillips, which she is bending over backwards to protect, even if it has nothing to do with her constituents. An oil lease in Alaska was getting a lot of local pushback, but here comes Shaky Susan to put in her 2 cents. She went on and on about how Biden was causing high energy prices and why they needed to approve this project, even though it was thousands of miles away from any of her voters. It's pretty obvious that she just wanted to protect her investments in the oil and gas companies, especially this one, ConocoPhillips. If this was about energy in general, then she would have encouraged Trump to continue Biden's clean energy initiatives and prove to him that windmills aren't the thing that's making him crazy. Graham wasn't playing when he said that Collins is sending Americans to die in order to fill her own coffers. Susan is openly benefiting from the destruction of Iran and the genocide in Gaza. You can tell from the slimy questions she asks Marco Rubio in the Senate.
Is our country working with our allies in the region or with American oil producers, Canadian oil producers, to look to the future on what could be done to mitigate the consequences of such a dependence on this particular strait in the future?
She's asking if the country is working with American oil and gas companies to come in and replace all of the oil and gas infrastructure that our country just destroyed. I mean, they aren't even trying to hide the fact that they're bloodthirsty, money-hungry monsters who feast on the sacrifice of the working class. This is why the establishment on both sides of the aisle hate Graham Platner, because the Democrats have these exact same investments. Why do you think the leader of the Democratic Party is bending over backwards to congratulate Susan Collins?
I want to join my colleague and all of my colleagues in congratulating Susan Collins, who will cast her 10,000th consecutive roll call vote in a few moments.
Not one of them sees the irony of praising 10,000 votes. That is not a good thing. They're not Pokemon cards. She's not supposed to be getting that many. But the Democrats see no problem with it because they are in the exact same boat. Lifelong politicians, so deeply embedded with the private sector that they can't be removed. Susan Collins not supporting a ban on stock trading is part of the reason why the Democrats are protecting her. Whereas Graham, well, he sounds less likely to play ball.
Term limits and getting money out of politics, I think, are two things that, until we fix them, we might continue finding ourselves back here in the same place. And when I talk about structural change, this is one of the things I'm talking about. We need to enact term limits. I've heard all the arguments for, I've heard all the arguments against. What I have seen in reality over the past 40 years tells me that we need this. I also think it needs to be part of a larger kind of democracy reform where we ban stock and bond trading by people in office. We absolutely need to pass a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United and get corporate money out of politics.
One thing Platner has always been clear about is his stance against trading in Congress, and he has been clear against his stance against oil wars in the Middle East. And the truth is, Graham is cutting right through the noise to meet people where they are and have the same conversations that I have with real people across the political spectrum in the real world.
It's billionaires in corporate power who for decades now have dumped money into the pockets of establishment politicians like Susan Collins, who instead of showing up for their constituents year after year, decade after decade, change the rules. Change the rules so the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and we continue to feel like we have no chance.
This is why the establishment hates him. This is why both Democrats and the GOP are standing behind Collins. And this is why you should support progressives and Democratic Socialist candidates. Subscribe to U.S. Democratic Socialists. I'm Tony Hinderman, and I'll catch you next time.